So we have some 20 minutes for questions. Maybe we can use another 5, if that's okay, Maria? Yeah, okay. So, any questions, comments? Glavki.
Okay, thank you very much for all these interesting presentations. I have a question for the first presentation. I was wondering, while I was hearing you, whether there is any discourse about amateur photography in the period you talked about in Italy. I mean, in Italian, in the press, for instance, or maybe not only about photography as an amateur practice, but also about art generally. Because the term amateur versus professional has a long history, and especially in the 19th century. So I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. We, of course, we are trying to delve into these two terms because, as you were saying, it's very charged, the fact of giving an amateur identity rather than a professional one, and especially in the case of women, we can expect that women tends to be, let's say, put to the amateur side, right, rather than the professional one, which is something that with this archival research, it's also something that we are trying to counterbalance somehow, also by these two cases that we chose. So there were a lot of professional in the, let's say, commonly accepted sense of professional, so making a living, let's say. But yeah, of course, the fact that Teresa De Giorgis or also other women that were, especially, let's say, in the context of the Italian Photographic Society, but also other society, there is this clear it emerged this clear distinction between men as the photographer, and then the women are always listed as amateur, right? So in the society especially. And so, as we were saying, on the one hand, it's a way to have women enter it, have the presence of women within this society, but at the same time, it's a way to marginalize them again through this label of the amateur. So it's very clear also, not just from the Italian Photographic Society, but also in the same bulletin, you have the report of other societies, and you always have the photographer and a male name, and then the Miss, Mrs., and then you have the name of a female, rather amateur or professional, but you felt them that are like put aside from the professional side. But I don't know if Linda wants to.
No, just a quick addition about it. It's also for us a way of also put at work other categories, and for instance for us was very important to highlight the fact that the Marzini sisters, just mentioning the case studies that we have presented today, has a precise social status, and Teresa De Giorgis has a higher social status. So also these categories of amateur and professionals were used also in order to highlight the social status, meaning that the professional were coming from an more humble social status, and they have to acquire an income to live, and the other ones, they comes from a higher social status. So for us it's very important also, like, try to work a little bit in intersectionality, putting at work also other social categories, for instance the provenance of class.
Anybody else? Well, I'd like to ask something, Orla. I've been wondering, listening to this fascinating story about the Status magazine, were there any incidents of censorship or backlash related to their choices when they dealt with controversial issues and subjects, and how they actually managed to overcome, if they did?
I think there were no, at that stage, there wasn't per se censorship, and I think the editor would have had a very good idea of what they could get away with and what they could discuss. So they did discuss protests, they did discuss what the gay clubs is what they called them then. They did discuss abortion rights, because there was lead up to referenda and this was on the table, so those things were discussed. Of course, it was coming into a time whereby certain members of certain organisations could not be reproduced, like the IRA or the UVF or whatever. That couldn't be, they couldn't be broadcast. So that was an act that was put in. So they would have been underneath that as well, but not overt censorship per se. That, like, I think this all went through lawyers beforehand of the team, so self-censorship, but it was, a lot of things were discussed and quite open, and I was shocked to see the mother and baby homes discussed in such an open way, because you very seldom see imagery from inside, or the babies or the mothers, so that is unusual and brave, and it's quite recent, well, it feels quite recent to me, so that was, you know, so I think they pushed the boundaries, but I didn't encounter any overt mentions of censorship or something being pulled.
Thank you. Hi, I just wanted to ask Evie Papadopoulou about, you mentioned Ellie Papadimitriou, the photographer, and you mentioned that she was a feminist photographer. How did, I mean, I'm sorry, I might have missed it, you might have mentioned it, but how did we get to the conclusion that she was a feminist photographer?
I didn't say she was a feminist photographer. I said that she had feminist interests. Right. She came from a family, her mother was passionate for the right of women to vote. And she also had feminist preoccupations. There's a book about her by Ioanna Petropoulou where she explains the whole life of Ellie Papadimitriou and her feminist approach towards life. But she was not a feminist photographer. She had rather feminist issues concerning her. And that was rather innovative for that time.
Yeah, exactly.
Also, Nina Emanuel was a feminist. She was the secretary of the Greek Association of the Association of Greek Women Artists. She was a feminist. She had a rather feminist identity, more obvious than Papadimitriou, if you want to say so. But she also had feminist issues.
But they all came from quite affluent families.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So photography was associated with
class issues, yes. The amateurs of that time were people who were doctors, lawyers. They had a social identity rather high.
Thank you to all of you for wonderful papers. In part, I'm trying to think about how your papers speak to one another. And, you know, this panel seems to be organized based on national origin, right, to some extent. And perhaps even your final slide, Orla, with that particular language leads me to this question. So I'm wondering if each of you could say something about how your research in these particular case studies, what connections you see to the formation of a national identity and the politics of that, for better or for worse. So women photography and formation of national identity.
Okay, I start. Thank you very much. Yes, my the first thing that comes to my mind refers to this representation of photographic types that we didn't have the time to go into. Because in parallel with the national formation that started in 1861, let's say the Italian unification, you have this use of photography, of course, and this representation of not the space, the Italian space, but also this urge to represent the Italian citizens, but especially through its traditions. So you have this very strong attention to the representation of popular traditional costumes and ethnographic types that really is really present inside the Italian Photographic Society, for example. There are the founder of the Italian Photographic Society is Mantegazza, which is also the founder of the Museum of Anthropology, which is also, so there is this connection between the use of anthropology, the use of photography, and the constitution of national institutions. So these three topics are very much linked, and with different shades, of course. I mean, you can see this use of ethnographic photography changing throughout the times, and also, for example, in this proposal that we briefly mentioned toward the creation of a survey on the Italian population, there is on the one hand this attempt to control the, let's say, the popular class, and to represent them, and on the other hand there is this idea to show the social condition, so a little bit this interest in the in the social condition of the Italian people. So you always have these two levels that interconnects.
Yeah, and as far for women, we are trying to verify something that for now is in the shape of hypothesis, so maybe next year I would say, no, I was completely wrong last year, but the fact that in the specialized publication in the first wave of feminism, so feminism, let's say, located at the end of the 19th century, photography is not really considered a tool of communication between the first groups of feminists. And this is actually also the reason this first group of feminists that, of course, were very involved in the formation of the new Italian nation, of course. So this is also the reason why, for instance, at least for Italy, women didn't feel the urge of founding their own photographic societies, but this is also valid for other countries, for instance. So this idea that the interconnections between historical interconnections between feminism and photography is something that started a little bit later. But again, this is an hypothesis that we want to verify. Thank you for the question.
So, my turn. I'll try to reply briefly, so as to have time for more questions, if any. In the 1950s and the 1960s was a period rather turbulent in Greece. It was just after the civil war between the national guerrilla, between the Greek guerrillas and the national army. The society was divided into parts. Photography at that time, not only photography produced by women, but photography in general, gave an image of a country which was in plain development, progress. In specific, women photographers gave an even more detached image from the reality of that time. In the cities, there was a big wave of people coming from the village. There was a big wave for reconstruction, but also very big social issues, gaps between people, social, economic. All these things were not represented by photographers in general. By women either. Women, as we saw, gave a more idealized view of the city. They confronted the city as a landscape, as a visual artifact, and not as a social space. And that had also to do with national identity at that time, because it was a period of censorship, it was also a period of expulsion of communists, it was a period of social tension that it was not allowed to be represented as such in the press of the time or in the illustrated journals. The illustrated journals presented a more ideal view of the society of the time. And that goes with the women saw and represented city as well.
I think really it's only 60 years after the partition of the island and the formation of two new states, and they're playing out exactly national identity is everything, and what those two states can be and what they become, how wealthy they are, they're all informed. And I think really the arguments and the things that are coming up in this magazine play out in what we heard of in Emma's talk this morning. These issues are being raised and reconciled on some cases, but in some cases many of these things are still live issues. And really the feasibility of the magazine is perhaps part and parcel of how wealthy or how poor the Republic of Ireland was at the time, and the demographics of a reduced population making this not feasible. Yeah.
Listen.
Thank you very much for your panel and all your talks. I had a train of thought set off by Evie's reference to the flaneur, which is I think, a specifically male character from the late 19th century on the street. And Janet Wolff's use of the term flaneurs to distinguish the difference between the male and female, or rather, gendered bodies on the street. That, like in the 19th century, in English law, if a woman stood still on the street, they could be arrested for soliciting as prostitution. But then, in a more general sense, the woman as a photographer on the street, in relation to the man on the street, whether that body engenders or enables a very different kind of relation to the environment of the street. And in a way, what was interesting across the papers is there are two spaces. There's the studio and the street, which are two classical spaces in photography, right? And increasingly the street has been thought of as a non-consensual space for taking pictures, right? So I was just wondering whether that, you referred to the flaneur, but I'm thinking, here are women in post-war Greece on the street. This is a very different situation, and whether from looking at the archives of those pictures you feel there's something different from the guys who were doing work on the street.
Yes, I think there was a slight difference. That's why I demonstrated also slides made, photographs made by men. For example, in the exhibition Athens by Night, the only woman photographer who took part in the exhibition, in Emmanuel, she rather concentrated on the shop windows of the time. On the contrary, her male peers, they walked in the city, they photographed the architecture, they photographed the avenues. So, yes, there was a difference. Men were more spontaneous, they were more active in the street than women. Women were more reserved. They kept, in my opinion, an attitude of defense in the street. So, yes, I think there was a gap between a female body in the street in the 1950s and a male body in the street.
May I add something very, very briefly about it? Because actually we ask ourselves exactly the same question while noticing that, for instance, one of the pictures that we have shown is a picture by night and has been very, very detailed, described in the paragraph describing that picture. For sure, the description is by the author, by Teresa De Giorgis, and we were asking ourselves, where is she actually? Where is she? Because it was quite unlikely that at 9:30 in the evening she could be there for 1 hour to take the photograph. And this is something that also make us think that maybe it was on a terrace of a private house, for instance, and we are looking for information about it.
So, do we call it a day, or is there another? Thank you all.